Today I want to share with you how to make a very easy 2-ingredient gluten-free bread. You may know this as socca, or you may know it as farinata or farinata di cicci. But whatever you call it, you're gonna love it. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary from Mary's Nest and author of the Modern Pioneer Cookbook, and I want to welcome you to my kitchen. Now making socca or farinata, as my sweet Italian mom would call it, only requires 2 ingredients: chickpea flour and water. Now we're going to mix this together, but I am going to talk to you a little bit more later about chickpea flour and how to make your own homemade. Now, as I said, you can keep this very basic with just the chickpea flour and the water. However, if you want to jazz it up a little, you can also add in a little salt and some olive oil, but that's totally up to you. Now, this is the chickpea flour that I found at my local grocery store, and this is a chickpea flour that I ordered online. So it is available online if you can't find it at your local grocery store. However, I will say I'm really impressed with the variety of different types of flours many grocery stores are carrying today. So you may very well find this at your grocery store. Now I'm just going to go ahead and dump this down into a bowl to make it easier to measure. Now chickpea flour is very forgiving. You don't need to get fussy at all with sifting or anything like that when you're measuring it. All you're going to do is just scoop in and level off 1 cup. Since I'm just making a small amount of batter, I'm just going to go ahead and use this large measuring cup, but you can use a bowl, whatever you have, and you can definitely double or triple this recipe. So I've got my chickpea flour in here, and now I've just got a cup of room temperature water, and in that goes. And that's your batter. Now I'm going to go ahead and add the optional ingredients in case that's something that you want to do. And all you have to do is just do it at this point right after you add in your water. You can go ahead and sprinkle in a ½ teaspoon of salt, and I just use a fine ground sea salt, but whatever you have on hand will work. And the second optional ingredient is olive oil. I'm going ahead with my Texas olive oil, but anything you have will work great. And you can just put in about 1 tablespoon or 2. It's really, none of this, these are ancient recipes, and none of this is really written in stone. I'm going to put in about 1.5 tablespoons, but 1 tablespoon, 2 tablespoons, don't worry about it. It's very flexible and very forgiving. Now all you're going to do is I'm going to use my little magic whisk that I absolutely love, but any whisk or wooden spoon, whatever you have will work fine. And I'm just going to go ahead and mix this up until the water and the olive oil are completely incorporated with the chickpea flour. Now I want to take a minute to talk with you about the batter. Modern day recipes will say to let this soak, this chickpea flour in the water, soak for about 30 minutes. But traditionally, and you know I'm all about traditional foods and traditional methods, traditionally this is something that was generally left to soak for 2 hours, and sometimes even longer. Now my mom would definitely just cover this with a dish towel, set it aside in her kitchen, and let it soak for at least 2 hours. So that's what I do too. And I have made this in a rush, as well as allowing it to soak the proper amount of time. And I have found that the final product is much better if you do let this soak for at least 2 hours. The texture and especially the interior texture is a lot better on a longer soak than a shorter soak. So I'm just going to set this aside, let it rest for 2 hours, and now I want to talk to you about how to make your own chickpea flour. Although buying chickpea flour does make this whole process very convenient, it's actually not that difficult to make your own chickpea flour, and for a fraction of the cost of what it would be to actually buy the flour pre-made for you. But there's something even more interesting about being able to make it yourself. Because if you want, you can just make the basic chickpea flour, or you can roast the chickpeas, the whole chickpeas, and make a toasted chickpea flour, which makes for an exceptionally tasty socca, or any other baked good that you go ahead and use your chickpea flour for. Now, I use a lot of chickpeas in soups and stews, just tossed with olive oil and oregano, used to make hummus and so on and so forth. So I like to buy a big bag of them and then store some of them in a nice airtight jar in my pantry. Now, what I'm sharing here with you are all dried chickpeas. And we're going to talk about that, the difference between that and canned chickpeas in a minute. But if you're not ready to forge ahead with big bags of dried chickpeas, you can certainly find these at your grocery store. And there's usually different brands available to you. These are the ones just from my local H-E-B. Those of you who live in Texas will recognize that brand. And then, of course, there's a very popular Goya brand. They have very nice, high-quality beans of any variety. You can even tell the difference if you look at the ones that have been packed in the Goya bag versus the ones that have been packed in the store bag. But eventually, in the end, they all shape up very nicely. But you'll notice that the Goya beans are a little larger. But whatever the case may be, there are smaller packages available to you. Now, I'm using the term chickpea, but you may also know these as garbanzo beans, or the Italian word cicci. My mother always called them cicci. And you may also know them as chana. And when you're looking at chickpea flour in the store, you may find different names associated with the particular chickpea flour that you're looking at and considering buying. The reason for having different names for the chickpea flour, like maybe graham flour, now that's not to be confused with the wheat flour that was invented by Dr. Graham for making graham crackers, but just the GRAM flour. You may see different names like that because a different variety of chickpea was used to make that particular flour. But any of the chickpea flours can be used to make soka. There may be some mild differences in flavor or texture of the end product, but it's really not very noticeable. Now, in addition to the dried chickpeas, you can also find canned chickpeas at your local grocery store. These are very common. And again, you're going to find a variety of brands. I just have these that are from my local grocery store. They are organic. My grocery store makes a big deal about having to have a lot of organic products, but there's definitely non-organic options. They have the Goyas that are non-organic, and they have Goyas that are organic. It's really up to you and what fits best for your budget. But both of these can be used to make chickpea flour. Now, if you decide you want to make chickpea flour starting with dried chickpeas, all you have to do is soak your chickpeas in water for at least 24 hours. And to that water, you want to add some sort of acidic medium. You're going to acidulate the water. And you can do that with a little lemon juice, a little vinegar, a little whey, whatever you have on hand. Now, you don't have to write any of this down because in addition to this video, you're going to have a very detailed blog post and recipe that's going to go along with this video. And that'll be over on my website, Mary's Nest, and I'll be sure to put a link to it in the description below. Now, you may be saying, Mary, I often just soak my beans for a few hours and then cook them, or maybe at most I soak them overnight for 8 to 12 hours. And I understand that completely. But I'll tell you a little tip here. I'll share a little tip here with you. Chickpeas really do better if they're soaked longer. I have even recommended to soak chickpeas for 48 hours. But whatever the case may be, I really would try to soak them for 24 hours at least. And all you want to do is change the water at the 12-hour mark, refresh the water that you fill the pot or pan, whatever you're soaking your chickpeas in, reacidulate it, and let it sit for another 12 hours. Then after their nice soak, all you're going to do is give them a good rinse, put them back into the pot, fill it with water to cover, bring the water up to a boil, and then let the chickpeas, then you're going to turn it down to a low simmer, and you're going to let the chickpeas simmer until they're tender. Then once they've cooked until they're tender, you're ready to move on to the next step. Now, can you skip all of that and just go ahead and grind these dried chickpeas as is? Yes, you can do that, but I prefer to soak them and then re-dry them. And the reason is chickpeas, like many beans, most beans, contain anti-nutrients. And you may have already heard a lot about this in the past if you've been with me for a while. But anti-nutrients can just make foods difficult to digest, can strip nutrients from our body and make it difficult for us to absorb the nutrients in our food to begin with. One of these anti-nutrients that you may have heard a lot about is phytic acid. Now, phytic acid also has a good side to it also. However, being able to deactivate some of that phytic acid in the beans makes it easier for us to digest and makes it easier for us to absorb nutrients. The soaking process in the acidulated water is what helps to deactivate some of the phytic acid. Now, it doesn't deactivate all of the phytic acid, but that's okay, because phytic acid, as I mentioned earlier, also has a good side. Phytic acid has antioxidant properties, which can help combat disease. So by soaking our chickpeas before turning them into flour, we get the best of both worlds. We deactivate some of the phytic acid, but not all of the phytic acid, making it a more perfect food. And the nice thing about soaking our dried chickpeas is that when we move on to the next step, we can remove the skins. And that does help to make a finer flour. Also, another nice benefit of soaking your dried chickpeas and then re-drying them is that during the re-drying process, you can roast them and then create a nice roasted chickpea flour, which is exceptionally flavorful. So there's a couple of nice benefits to starting with dried chickpeas, but taking the extra step to rehydrate them and then dry them, as opposed to just forging ahead with the dried chickpeas as is. You deactivate some of the phytic acid, and you have the option of leaving them plain or roasting them. And one other thing I want to mention about soaking is that when you soak chickpeas, or any beans for that matter, they can begin to sprout. And now you're making, in essence, a sprouted chickpea flour or a sprouted bean flour. And the nice thing about sprouting beans is that you release a lot of the nutrients, making them more absorbable by our digestive system. So you've created a wonderful product that's much more nutritious than if you just took these beans and ground them into a flour. And in many cases, they will start to sprout within that 24-hour soak, maybe even before that. And you might even notice that when you buy canned chickpeas, when you open them, they've got the little sprouts starting to come out. Now, before we move on to talking about drying beans and turning them into flour, drying the chickpeas and turning them into flour, let's just take a second to talk about using canned chickpeas. Now, the nice thing about canned chickpeas, and this is really, in my humble opinion, is that they, in essence, have been soaking in a salty brine for who knows for how long that they've been canned. So I don't feel it's necessary to take the step of re-soaking them in an acidulated brine. And again, this is in my humble opinion. If you feel differently, I would love to hear about it in the comments. If you've found canned beans don't always agree with you, that would be very interesting to hear. But in my humble opinion, I feel they've been soaking in this brine, and if some phytic acid was deactivated, it's probably as much as it's going to be deactivated. So I don't go ahead and re-soak these. But what I do is just put them in some fresh water. I rinse them well, put them in some fresh water, and I remove the skins. And I'll show you a very easy way to do that. So canned chickpeas are an option for making chickpea flour. It's just going to be more costly than starting with the dried chickpeas. And it's really just a sliding scale, what fits in your budget, what fits in your time frame, and so on and so forth. But this is going to be the most reasonable way, using dried chickpeas to make chickpea flour. The second most reasonable way will be using canned chickpeas. And then the third, I won't necessarily say most reasonable, but the more costly option, the third option, is to just buy chickpea flour. But personally, again, in my humble opinion, I really think starting with the dried or starting with the canned does give you a more flavorful product in the end. I'm going to walk you through and show you all the steps of how we're going to remove the skins, how we're going to dry these, and so on and so forth. But I just want to take a minute to talk to you about grinding these dried chickpeas once everything is dried, into flour, and what are some of your options for doing that, and what I think are some of maybe the better options. Now, I've got my little spice grinder over here, and I get a lot of questions about this. I've had this a while, but if I can find this, I'll put a link to it in the description below. It's the best spice grinder I've ever had. This one's made by KitchenAid, and you will see some recipes will say, put your dried chickpeas into here and grind them up, and you have your chickpea flour. You can definitely do that, but depending on how much chickpea flour you want to make, this can be a little bit of a slow-going process because you can only put so much in here. You don't want to really fill it more than halfway because you want to give room for the chickpea flour to really move around and not just get overground on the bottom and overheated, and the top not mixing out too well. That was my ice maker. It's very noisy. The other option that I have seen folks recommend is to use a food processor. So let's take a minute to talk about that. This is my food processor. I've had it for many years. It's a KitchenAid. This is back in the day when both Cuisinart, this is how old this is, but it's held up beautifully. Back in the day when Cuisinarts and KitchenAid food processors were both made in France, still made in France. I think most of them today are made in China. I know this one is excellent. It's just a workhorse. But whether or not you want to grind your chickpeas in your food processor, mine is old. I don't really worry about it, and I know it's very powerful. And as I said, it's a workhorse. And because it's older, the pitcher part here is already very scratched up. And it's just over the years, I mean, even just grinding up hard cheeses can do this. And so I just want to give you a heads up. So in case you have a relatively new food processor, or you have one with a very pristine bowl like this, I think I called it a pitcher earlier, know that after grinding chickpeas in it, it's going to look more like this. It's going to be like all scratched up. And I always like to give everybody a heads up on that, because I know I've seen sometimes in comments of people who are doing this with recipes that recommend just using the food processor to grind up the chickpeas, that they're a little horrified after the process when they look at their bowl. So, I don't worry about these things because I use my appliances a lot. And as I said, mine's old. I will confess with you, maybe this is 20 years old. I'm not even sure how old this is. I will confess with you, when it was brand new and I was so excited about it, it was the first time I ever had a food processor. And I think maybe within the first week, I ground some Parmigiano Reggiano chunks that I put in here, and it scratched it all up. And I was like, oh no. Then after that, I was like, okay, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to be using this so much, it's going to get a little wrecked up. So, but just a heads up, because I want you to be mad at me and say, oh, I know, I used my new food processor and now it's all messed up. Hopefully it's got a good strong motor and it can handle the chickpeas. Just the bowl may look different afterwards. Now, what about using a high-speed blender? That's also an option, but again, always check with your manufacturer's guidelines and see what they approve of and don't approve of. I have a Vitamixer. Again, it's very old. That one's really old. That was when they were actually made in the United States, in the state of Ohio. And it has a metal container. Actually, I bought it at a cooking show. It's 1991 or 1990, something like that. And it was actually a reconditioned commercial model. It's still going strong. It's amazing. And given that it has that metal container, it's very easy to go ahead and grind some chickpeas in that, whole grains, coffee beans, anything you want. Again, if you have the more modern day ones and they have the plastic container, not unlike the plastic bowl of the food processor, know that your container may look different after you grind chickpeas in it. It may be scratched up. Now, what's the last option? And that's using a grain mill. And that is my favorite option. And the good news is that grain mills do have a wide variety of price ranges. If you've been with me a while, you know I love my Mach mill. It's very affordable and it's a stone grinding mill, which means it's very good at protecting the oils in whatever you're grinding. And I'll put information below about my particular Mach mill. But if you are thinking of really getting into creating a traditional foods kitchen and you want to start grinding your own grain, grinding your own corn, grinding your beans, so on and so forth, your dried beans, I highly recommend giving serious thought to researching grain mills. And I did so much research before I bought my grain mill. I had just a hand crank, the old-fashioned type grain mill, which is great, you know, for power problems and so on and so forth. But in terms of an electric grain mill, I did a lot of research. And I finally settled on the Mach mill, and it was nice. It was in my price range. They're not very expensive, yet they are such high quality. And so that's what I think is your best option for grinding your chickpeas. But know that if you're okay doing it in small batches with a spice grinder, that can work. I actually think that does a very good job. Alternatively, your food processor or your high-speed blender, just keep in mind your vessel may look a little different after everything's said and done. Also, if you use a spice grinder, a food processor, or a blender, you may have to sift out some bits that didn't get ground quite correctly. You can regrind them if you want, or just use them in some other way. But don't just start baking with all of those little bits still intact in your flour. Go ahead, regrind them, or just save them for making something else. Now, there is something very important that I want to share with you about chickpea flour. Do not get overzealous about using chickpea flour unless you're cooking with it or baking it. Chickpeas are high in something called lectins. And if lectins aren't broken down through the cooking process, they can cause a lot of digestive upset. So I don't want you to take some of this and say, oh, it's protein, it's good for me, and put it in a smoothie, or mix it with water and olive oil and think you're making a quick hummus. Please don't do that. Cook with your chickpea flour or bake with your chickpea flour. It can deactivate, the heating process can deactivate, some believe, up to 95% of the lectins. So make sure chickpea flour is just for cooking and baking. Now, about 30 minutes before your batter is ready, you want to go and preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. And you want to go ahead and put your cold cast iron skillet into the cold oven so that both preheat together. And you do not want to put any fat in here. You want to just put in a clean, dry cast iron skillet. Now, if you don't have a cast iron skillet, don't worry. You can use any type of oven-proof skillet. The nice thing about making soka is that it's actually very flexible. If you don't want to make it in the oven, you don't have to. In many ways, it's like making pancakes. And if you have a griddle, you can pour your batter right onto the griddle. And when it starts to get bubbles on top, the same way a pancake would, you can flip it over and continue cooking it. So that's another option to you as well. As a matter of fact, legend holds that Roman soldiers would make soka and grill it, in essence, on their shields that were heated up in the hot Italian sun. Basically, whether we're doing it in the oven or on a griddle, is to try to mimic as closely as possible to the soka that's a very common street food that's often cooked on a griddle. So by doing it in a cast iron pan or an oven-proof pan in the oven at a high temperature, or doing it actually on a griddle, gets as close as possible to copying the common soka that's served today. Now, not only is cooking the soka flexible, The nice thing about it is the batter is also flexible. As I shared, yes, many recipes will say you can just soak it for 30 minutes, and certainly if you're in a rush, I'm sure that'll work out okay. I do find soaking it for 2 hours does make a better end product, but did you know you can soak your Soka batter up to 24 hours and still create a really nice end product. If you're comfortable, you can leave it right on your countertop, but if you prefer, you can put it into your refrigerator. The only difference being, if you put it into your refrigerator, you'll just want to let it allow to come up to room temperature before you proceed with cooking it, whether in the oven or on a griddle. Now, while we're waiting for that oven to come up to temp, when we'll go ahead and bake our Soka, I want to show you how to prepare the chickpeas in order to get them ready to be dehydrated, whether you do that in an actual dehydrator or whether you do that in a cool oven. Now, what I've got here are chickpeas that I soaked for 24 hours in an acidulated water. I used raw apple cider vinegar, but any vinegar can work. You really don't need raw apple cider vinegar because you will be heating this, but that's what I had on hand. You could also, as I mentioned earlier, use lemon juice or whey. Then, once they had soaked for 24 hours, and I changed the water at the 12-hour soak, I put them in, rinsed them and put them in fresh water, and then I brought the mixture up to a boil. And once it came up to a boil, I turned it down to a low simmer, and I let the chickpeas cook until they were cooked, I let them simmer until they were fully cooked. Now what I'm going to do is take this colander over to my sink. I'm going to drain the chickpeas, give them a good rinse, and then I'll show you how we remove the skins. So once you drain the chickpeas into your colander in the sink and give them a good rinse, you then want to put them into a large bowl. The larger the bowl, the better. And once you get them into the bowl, fill the bowl with at least double the amount of water as the chickpeas. You're not just talking about covering the chickpeas, you're talking about adding a lot of water to the bowl. Then you're just going to go into the bowl and you're going to start moving the chickpeas around and rubbing them between your hands. And as you do this, the skins will effortlessly come off and float to the top. So as you keep rubbing the chickpeas in the water and through your hands and dumping them back down into the water, the skins will loosen very easily and they'll sit right on the top of all of the chickpeas, and then you can just begin to remove them. Also, a slotted spoon can work well for getting all of the skins out of the water. Now my oven came up to temp, 450 degrees Fahrenheit. My pan is nice and hot. Now all I'm going to do is just put a little bit of olive oil in here. If you want, you can cook this on a very dry skillet if you prefer not to add the olive oil. I'm just adding a little bit of olive oil here just to coat the bottom of the pan. But again, skip it if you want. Then I'm going to take my handy dandy whisk here, magic whisk. I had to think about that for a minute. You'll notice the batter will be a little thicker. That's totally fine. Then I'm going to take this and I'm going to pour it right into the frying pan. Be very careful because everything's really hot. And if you were doing this on a skillet, you would just do it the way you would making pancakes. You could even make smaller Sokas. You spread that around. Oh, it's going to be beautiful. And I may have already said this, but if you decide not to add any fat in, make sure that you're using a very well seasoned cast iron pan or some type of pan in which this won't stick. Now I'm going to go ahead and put this back into my oven. It is set at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're making this for the first time, keep an eye on it because every oven is different. You may need to go down to 425 or you may find you need to go up to 475 to get everything to cook or to get the Soka to cook efficiently. I find 450 works well for me for somewhere between 8 and 10 minutes. So somewhere between 8 and 10 minutes, you're going to notice that there's going to be small cracks that may appear on top of your soka. That means it's done baking. However, if you want the top to be brown as well, you have two options. If you're a brave soul, and maybe if you have a pancake flipper, you can get in there, flip it over, and put it back in the oven for another minute or two. Alternatively, you can just turn on the broiler and keep a close watch on it. I'm going to turn on the broiler. Now I'm going to keep a close eye on the broiler to make sure that that just becomes a nice golden brown and nothing more. But while we're waiting for that, I want to show you how to dry or dehydrate your chickpeas after having rehydrated them. All you need to do is just take a baking sheet. Don't worry about any water that's still dripping. That's fine. And put some what is this called? Parchment paper. I had to think about that for a minute. Parchment paper, aluminum foil. I'd like parchment paper, but use whatever you have. And then just put a single layer of the chickpeas onto the parchment paper. And you can put, multiple baking sheets in your oven depending on how many racks you have. And just make sure that they're not overlapping and that you leave a little airspace between all of them. Then you're going to go ahead and put these into your oven on its lowest setting. That may be 200 degrees Fahrenheit, that may be 170 degrees Fahrenheit, or if you're lucky, it might be 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Then all you're going to do is let them dry in your oven. It varies on exactly how long it's going to take, depending on how low your oven setting is, but you're probably going to be looking anywhere from 4 hours to 6 hours. So just keep checking them, and even if you have to go a little longer, that's fine, because you want them to be really dry. If you decide to do this in a dehydrator, all you want to do is make sure that you put them on a mesh sheet. You do not want any of those silicone mats, just a mesh sheet. And then you're going to do the same thing you did on your baking sheet. You're just going to try to make a nice single layer and give them some room in between each other so they get good air circulation to dry. Now, in a dehydrator, you're going to set it for 125 degrees Fahrenheit, and these are going to take anywhere from 8 to 10 hours to dry. And again, you just want to make sure they're really dry. And I'm going to bring you back, it'll probably be tomorrow, and I will show you exactly what these look like when they are dry. And then we'll grind them and we'll make the chickpea flour. I'll also show you, maybe with the oven batch, because you can't do this in the dehydrator, but in the oven batch, maybe we'll roast them a little and we'll make roast chickpea flour. Now I had this under the broiler for about a minute or two, and it got some nice color on it. Now, if you did want to flip it, this is what I was talking about, kind of a pancake flipper. And you can just get right in here. It shouldn't be difficult to do if you have one of these. And the soka should loosen relatively easy from a well-seasoned cast iron pan, and we put the olive oil in ours. And then you can just kind of be a little gentle about it, because this does get kind of crispy, so you don't want to break it. Now, soka is best eaten warm the day you make it. However, you can keep it at room temperature for a few days, and it'll be fine. Or if you want, once it's cooled, you can wrap it well, put it in a freezer-proof bag or a freezer-proof container, and you can store it in the freezer for up to a month. When you want to reheat the soka, either if you've left it at room temperature or it's frozen, you want to put it in a 400 degree Fahrenheit oven to help it crisp up. Now you can eat this as is. I like to use a pizza cutter and just cut it into quarters or eighths, whatever size you want. Or what I really like is to cut this up and then put a little bit of olive oil, drizzle a little bit of olive oil on top, and then put some herbs. They can be fresh, they can be dried, whatever you like. I actually like it best with some olive oil, a little bit of, I've got some of the fleur de sel, a little bit of the sea salt, the nice sea salt, a little crystallized, and some dried oregano. That's my favorite way. I'll also put in a shot of the undercrust so you can see that it's cooked nicely. In addition to just serving this as a side of bread for dinner or as a snack, this also can make a great personal pan pizza size. All you need to do is when it's done baking, take it out, put your favorite toppings on, put it back in the oven, put it under the broiler, and you've got a gluten-free pizza crust that's really easy to make. Now, all I like to do is just put a little bit of a drizzle of some olive oil on here, and then I'm going to go ahead and sprinkle on my dried oregano and a little bit, oh, this is going to be so tasty, and a little bit of the fleur de sel salt, but you can use whatever you want. The flaked sea salt would probably be very lovely too. Well, I've got this prepared just the way that I like it. Okay, time for a taste. It's so tasty. Even if you don't need to be gluten-free, which we're not a gluten-free household, this is such a tasty little flatbread, and it makes a great, makes a great pizza crust. And it's just so easy and such simple ingredients. Now let's get ready to finish off our chickpea project so we can make our own chickpea flour and have these available all the time without spending a lot of money to buy chickpea flour. Now I'm going to go ahead and put these in my dehydrator with other chickpeas I also have ready to dehydrate. However, these are going to go into the oven because I want to show you the two options. You can definitely just dry these in your oven, but before we dry them, I'm going to put them in a 350-degree Fahrenheit oven, and I'm going to roast them for maybe around 20 minutes. I'm going to keep my eye on them. I don't want them to get so brown like when you're making chickpea snacks and you roast them closer to 30 minutes where they get crispy and crunchy. And the reason is because we are going to let these dehydrate until they look again. I don't know if you can see, these are dried chickpeas. So we don't want them to get like over brown and crispy. We want to just get some color on them to give them some flavor. And then we're going to go ahead and then we're going to turn the oven down to 200, 170, or 150, whatever the lowest setting is, and let them just dehydrate for around 4 to 6 hours. You got to just check them. Now these were in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for about 20 minutes. And this is the color you're looking for. Just sort of golden, not that darker color when you turn them into real crisp chickpea snacks. You don't want to do that because that creates too dark a colored and too strongly a flavored flour. You want just a gentle roasting that just brings out a little bit more of that chickpea flavor. And you'll know you've done this correctly because if you pop one into your mouth, it'll be crisp on the outside, but it'll still be creamy on the inside. So now I'm going to put these back into my oven. My oven goes down to 170 degrees Fahrenheit, so I'm going to go ahead, put it at 170 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm going to start checking these at 4 hours and just keep going from there until they're to the point where they're really nice and hard. They're actually going to be hard. They're going to feel like little pebbles, just the way they do when they've been dried. When you buy them dried in the store, that's exactly what you're going to be looking for. And then I'm going to go ahead and put these into my dehydrator, 125 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is going to take 8 to 10 hours. And what I'm going to do is at about 4 hours, I'm going to just move them around a little, rotate, you can even rotate the sheets if you want, take them out. I find it just easier to pull them out halfway and just jiggle them around with my hands, just so that everything dries evenly. So when everything's dry, we'll grind them into flour and I'll show you the best way to store your chickpea flour. Well, I let these roasted chickpeas, or semi-roasted chickpeas, dry in my oven at 170 degrees Fahrenheit, and it took about 6 hours. And you'll know they're done when they're like little pebbles, see that? And they'll be very, very hard, and you know that that's perfect. There may be some variation in color, don't worry about that. That's just because there may have been some variation when we were semi-roasting them before drying them. Now what I've got over here is one of my trays of the dehydrated chickpeas. And these took, yeah, between 8 to 10 hours, somewhere in the middle, maybe about 9 hours to get to the point where I really wanted them nice and hard and dry. And you'll see I got the same effect as the ones we dried in the oven. They're like pebbles. And I checked at these around the 4-hour mark, and I just kind of moved them around on my dehydrator tray just to make sure everybody would dehydrate evenly. Now what we'll do is we'll grind these, and if you remember earlier in the video, we talked about the different options for grinding. And since I do have my mock mill here, this is what I'm going to grind them in. But you've got options, you know, with the food processor, with the spice grinder, with the high-speed blenders. So there's a lot of options when it comes to grinding chickpeas. Now I've just crumpled up my parchment paper, and I'm going to go ahead and put these into the hopper, so to speak, of my mock mill. Now what I like about the mock mill is I can set this, unlike if you're using the food processor or the spice grinder or one of the high-speed blenders. What I like about having a grain mill, and specifically mine, the mock mill, you can set how fine or coarse you want your final product to be. I generally, for the most part, keep mine on 5. A little bit of coarseness, but not a lot of coarseness. I don't, unless I'm doing some kind of special project where I want my flour to be particularly fine, or maybe a little more coarse, like maybe if I'm making an Irish soda bread or something like that and I want a little more coarse flour. But for the most part, I find 5 is perfect for everything, whether I'm grinding chickpeas or einkorn berries, so it works great. So I've got the lid on, and now I'm going to go ahead and turn this on, and we'll make our roasted chickpea flour. And this is very nice for alternating the flavor of the final product. Like if you're making soca or whatever the heck you're using this for, it will really turn out to have a new flavor profile so that you never get bored with chickpea flour. You have 2 options available to you. So this is just a beautiful chickpea flour. Look at this wonderful grind to it, wonderful texture. So I'm really happy with the 5. So if you have a mock mill, you can try, and you're grinding chickpeas, try it on the 5 and see if you like it. Now I want to show you the difference between the color of the roasted chickpea flour and the color of the chickpea flour that we bought from the grocery store. Now, this chickpea flour was just made with chickpeas. They were not roasted. And I'm not 100% sure how actual chickpea flour sold at the grocery store is made. I tried researching it, but I think they're just taking the dried chickpeas, as we talked about earlier, and grinding them into flour. I don't think they're going through the whole soaking and then re-drying them process, because I don't think they're too worried necessarily about the phytic acid issue. And they don't have to worry about the lectins, because when you bake with chickpea flour, you're getting rid of a lot of the lectins, so it shouldn't cause any digestive distress. But look, see, you can see it's quite different if you roast your chickpeas before drying them. And so I really encourage you, when you make the socas, make them whatever way you're doing it, whether you're getting the flour from the grocery store or you're drying your own chickpeas, whether in the oven or in the dehydrator. I highly recommend that you make your socas with the plain chickpea flour first, and then try making them with the roasted flour. And I'd be interested chickpea flour, and I'd be interested in hearing what you think of the taste difference. It does add almost like a little bit of a nutty flavor. It's very delightful. Now I'm going to take the chickpeas from our dehydrator sheet there, and let me put the lid on. Alrighty, let's grind these up. So this came out great, and something I found very interesting. First of all, we knew the colors would be different between the oven roasted chickpeas that were then dried and just the soaked and dried chickpeas. But something that makes me kind of happy is because I always feel the more yellow, the more colorful something looks, the more nutritious it is. This is the store-bought chickpea flour, and then this is our homemade chickpea flour. And it is interesting that the homemade one is a little more yellow. And maybe it has something to do with the soaking process and whatnot, but that makes me very happy because I feel that our homemade chickpea flour, maybe with the soaking process, sort of releasing more of the nutrients, has more of a yellow color to it, because we don't 100% know exactly what level of, what would the right word be, what level of preparation has been put into the store-bought chickpea flour. So I highly recommend, if you can, make your own chickpea flour. I think you're going to be very happy with the end product. And if you're looking for gluten-free options, chickpea flour is just wonderful because it's ancient. This is something that has been being made by civilizations for millennia. So you can't go wrong with chickpea flour. Now, if you're also interested in learning about a lot of other gluten-free flours, I have a video that's very detailed where I go into all of that, all the varieties of chickpea flours, all the variety of gluten-free flours that you have to choose from and how to mix and match and all of that. It's very detailed. So be sure to click on this video over here where I have that video plus a whole bunch more about gluten-free and grains in general. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.